In December of 1859, a woman vanished from a locked room in Charleston, South Carolina. The sheriff had surrounded her mansion with 12 armed men. A detective from New York had spent 3 years tracking her every move. The newspapers had already printed the headline announcing her arrest. But when they broke down the door to her bedroom, they found only an empty chair, a cold fireplace, and a single piece of paper on the desk. The note contained 7 words that would haunt investigators for the next century: "You count the dead, I count the saved." Her name was Martha Ann Price. The newspapers called her the Black Widow. They accused her of murdering 3 wealthy husbands in 18 years. They called her a monster, a demon, a cold-blooded killer who married men for their fortunes and poisoned them without mercy. But what nobody knew, what nobody would discover for another 140 years, was that Martha Ann Price had saved 57 children from a fate worse than death. 57 black children who had been bought and sold like cattle. 57 souls who should have spent their lives in chains. 57 human beings who made it to freedom in Canada because of a woman the world called a murderer. This is her story, and I need you to forget everything you think you know about heroes. The American South in 1859 was a world built on suffering. By that year, nearly 4 million black men, women, and children lived in bondage across 15 states. The cotton trade had transformed slavery from a dying institution into the economic engine of the entire nation. In South Carolina alone, enslaved people made up 57% of the total population. They had no rights. They had no protection. They were legally considered property, no different from a horse or a plow. But among all the horrors of American slavery, there was one practice that stood apart in its cruelty. One aspect of the trade that even some slaveholders found difficult to stomach: the selling of children. Enslaved children as young as 5 years old were routinely separated from their mothers and sold to distant plantations. Traders advertised them in newspapers like merchandise. They displayed them at auction blocks, forcing them to open their mouths so buyers could inspect their teeth. They measured their height, their weight, their potential for future labor, and then they sold them to the highest bidder, sending them hundreds of miles away from everyone they had ever loved. A healthy child between the ages of 8 and 12 could fetch between $300 and $500 at auction. Adjusted for today's money, that is roughly $12,000. The demand was enormous, the supply was endless, and the suffering was beyond measure. This was the world Martha Ann Price was born into. And this was the world she decided to destroy. Martha was born in 1825 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Her father, William Price, was a printer who published abolitionist pamphlets in secret. Her mother, Catherine, was a seamstress who had helped at least 4 runaway slaves find safe houses in the city. From her earliest memories, Martha understood that slavery was an abomination. She grew up hearing stories of the horrors happening just a few hundred miles south. She learned to read by studying newspaper accounts of slave auctions and plantation brutality. But understanding evil from a distance is very different from seeing it with your own eyes. In 1841, when Martha was 16 years old, her father's printing business failed. The family fell into debt, and that same year, a charming young merchant from Virginia named Thomas Whitmore came to Philadelphia on business. He was 28 years old, handsome, well-spoken, and wealthy. He met Martha at a church social and was immediately captivated by her intelligence and beauty. Thomas courted Martha for 3 months. He brought her flowers. He wrote her poetry. He told her stories of his beautiful plantation in Virginia, the rolling green hills, the peaceful countryside, the simple and happy life of the rural South. He never mentioned that he owned 47 human beings. He never told her how he had made his fortune. They were married in September of 1841. Martha was 16. She believed she was beginning a wonderful new life. She had no idea she was walking into a nightmare. The Whitmore plantation was located in Henrico County, Virginia, about 10 miles north of Richmond. When Martha first arrived at her new home, she was overwhelmed by its beauty. The main house was a grand white structure with tall columns and wide porches. The gardens were immaculate. The fields stretched as far as the eye could see. It took her 3 days to understand the truth. On her 3rd morning as a married woman, Martha walked down to the kitchen to meet the household staff. She expected to find servants. What she found instead were slaves. Black women with scarred backs and hollow eyes. Black men who flinched when a white person raised their voice. Black children who had been taught from birth to never look a white person in the eye. Martha later wrote in her secret journal that she felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. She had known slavery existed. She had read about it. She had prayed against it. But she had never stood 3 feet away from a woman whose children had been sold away from her. She had never looked into the eyes of a 12-year-old girl who had already been whipped twice for moving too slowly. That night, Martha confronted her husband. She demanded to know why he had never told her he owned slaves. Thomas laughed at her. He called her naive. He explained with perfect calm that slavery was the natural order of the world. That black people were inferior beings who benefited from the guidance of white masters. That she would come to understand this in time. Martha did not sleep that night. She lay in bed beside a man she suddenly realized she did not know at all, and she began to plan. For the first 2 years of her marriage, Martha watched and learned. She studied the way the plantation operated. She memorized the names of every enslaved person on the property. She learned their stories, their families, their dreams. She discovered that Thomas was not just a plantation owner. He was also involved in the domestic slave trade. He bought enslaved people from struggling farms in Virginia and sold them to cotton plantations in the Deep South. But what truly broke Martha's heart was the children. Thomas specialized in buying young children. He preferred them because they were cheaper and easier to transport. He would purchase 5 or 6 children at a time from local farms, hold them in a small cabin on his property for a few weeks, and then sell them to traders heading south to Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. The children would arrive terrified and confused. They would cry for their mothers every night. And then one morning, they would be loaded onto wagons and driven away. Most of them would never see their families again. Martha kept a secret count in her journal. In her first 2 years at the Whitmore plantation, she watched 31 children pass through her husband's hands. 31 children sold like livestock. 31 families destroyed forever. She knew she had to do something. But what could one woman do against an entire system? The answer came to her on a cold night in January 1843. Martha was in the kitchen, unable to sleep, when an old enslaved woman named Hetty came to stoke the fire. Hetty had been on the Whitmore plantation for 40 years. She had watched 3 of her own children sold away. She had lost her husband to the cotton fields of Mississippi and never learned what happened to him. That night, Hetty told Martha about the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was not a railroad at all. It was a secret network of safe houses, hidden routes, and brave individuals who helped enslaved people escape to freedom in the North or in Canada. By 1843, the network stretched across 14 states. It was operated by both black and white abolitionists who risked their lives and their fortunes to help people escape bondage. Hetty had heard whispers about the railroad for years. She knew that somewhere in Virginia there were people who could help, but she had never been able to find them. She was too old to run. Her remaining family was scattered across the state. She had given up hope of ever being free. But she saw something in Martha that night. She saw the fire in the young woman's eyes. She saw the rage that Martha had been hiding for 2 years. And she decided to trust her. If you really want to help, Hetty said, start with the children. They are small enough to hide. They are young enough to start over, and they are the ones who need saving most. Martha asked how she could possibly save children from a man who bought and sold them for profit. How could she get them to safety without being caught? How could she fight against a system that had the full support of the law? Hetty looked at her for a long moment. Then she said something that would change the course of Martha's life forever. You are a white woman married to a rich man. You can go anywhere. You can do anything. Nobody suspects a lady in a fine dress. Use what God gave you. Use it before it's too late. In the spring of 1843, Martha made contact with the Underground Railroad. She did it carefully, slowly, using every ounce of intelligence she possessed. She started by writing letters to old family friends in Philadelphia, asking innocent questions about abolitionist activities. She attended church services in Richmond and listened for anyone who spoke against slavery, even in whispers. She visited markets and shops, always watching, always listening. It took her 5 months to find the right person. His name was Samuel Green, a free black man who ran a small barber shop in Richmond. Samuel had been born into slavery in Maryland and had purchased his own freedom at the age of 25. Now at 42, he was one of the most important conductors on the Underground Railroad in Virginia. Their first meeting was tense. Samuel did not trust white women, especially not the wives of slave traders. But Martha showed him her journal. She showed him the list of names. She showed him the children she had watched disappear into the nightmare of the Deep South. And she told him exactly what she wanted to do. "I cannot save everyone," she said. "But I can save some. I can save the children. I can get them out before my husband sells them south." Samuel studied her for a long time. Then he asked her a question that would define everything that came next. "And what about your husband? What happens when he notices that his property keeps disappearing?" Martha looked at him with eyes that had gone cold and hard. She had thought about this question for months. She had prayed over it. She had wrestled with her conscience and her faith. And she had reached a conclusion that would have shocked her younger self. "My husband," she said slowly, "is not a good man. And bad things happen to men who are not good." The first child Martha saved was a 9-year-old boy named Isaiah. He had been purchased by Thomas from a farm in Charlottesville and was scheduled to be sold to a trader from Mississippi in 2 weeks. Isaiah had watched his mother collapse when the sale was made. He had been dragged away screaming while she begged on her knees for mercy that never came. Martha smuggled Isaiah out on a Sunday morning in June 1843. She hid him in a false bottom of a vegetable cart driven by a free black farmer named Peter who worked with the Underground Railroad. Peter drove the cart north toward Washington, D.C., where another conductor took over. From there, Isaiah was passed from safe house to safe house, traveling only at night, hiding in barns and cellars and secret rooms. 43 days after Martha lifted him out of that cabin, Isaiah crossed the border into Canada. He was given a new name, a new identity, and a new life. He would grow up to become a teacher. He would marry and have 5 children of his own. He would live to see slavery abolished, and he would never know the name of the white woman who had saved him. After Isaiah, there was no turning back for Martha. She had committed a crime punishable by years in prison. She had betrayed her husband. She had violated every law of the state of Virginia, and she had never felt more alive. Over the next 2 years, Martha saved 12 more children from her husband's holding cabin. She developed a careful system. She waited until Thomas was away on business. She drugged the overseer's coffee with laudanum, a common opiate that was easy to obtain from any pharmacy. She moved quickly, always at night, always using different routes and different conductors. She kept her secret so carefully that even Hetty did not know the full extent of what she was doing. And then in the winter of 1845, Thomas Whitmore fell ill. The official cause of death was listed as typhoid fever. The doctor who examined Thomas found nothing unusual. The symptoms were consistent with the disease: high fever, abdominal pain, bloody diarrhea, confusion, and eventually death. Typhoid was common in Virginia in those years. Thousands of people died from it every year. There was no reason to suspect foul play. But there was no typhoid fever in the Whitmore household. The water was clean, the food was fresh, nobody else on the entire plantation showed any sign of illness. Because Thomas Whitmore did not die of typhoid fever. He died of arsenic poisoning. Arsenic was easy to obtain in 1845. It was sold openly in pharmacies as rat poison. It was used in medicines, in cosmetics, in household products of every kind. And in small doses given over several weeks, it produced symptoms almost identical to typhoid: stomach pain, vomiting, diarrhea, confusion, and death. The poison accumulated slowly in the body. By the time the victim became seriously ill, it was already too late. Martha had been slipping arsenic into her husband's coffee for 3 weeks before he died. She had calculated the doses carefully, increasing them gradually so that his death would appear natural. She had watched him suffer, and she had felt nothing but cold satisfaction. This was the man who had sold 31 children into bondage. This was the man who had destroyed countless families without a moment's hesitation. This was the man who saw human beings as nothing more than property to be bought and sold. She did not consider it murder. She considered it justice. Thomas Whitmore died on February 14, 1845. He was 32 years old. Martha inherited everything: the plantation, the land, the money, and the 47 enslaved people who had been her husband's property. Within 6 months, all 47 were gone. Martha did not sell them.